Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about books. Today we're going to talk about the Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Now, if you've been around here for a minute, you know I'm not great at holding on to dust jackets, but in my defense, I bought this used and it didn't have a dust jacket, so it wasn't me this time. Although this year I'm going to try to get better about that, at least for the sake of videos. We'll see how long that lasts. I'm trying, y'all. The Martian Chronicles is a collection of short stories that imagine humans settling on Mars. What would that look like? What's already there? And I do want to point out first that these were published in the 1940s and 50s. We hadn't even made it to the moon yet. So our knowledge of what's on the surface of other planets was much, much more limited than it is today. And also these are science fiction, not science fact. So putting those things together, Ray Bradbury imagined that there was already a civilization on Mars when humans first got there. It should not surprise anybody. I really loved this. Spoiler, Ray Bradbury, even though I have not read all of his books, I intend to. Every one that I read, his writing is so gorgeous to me, and his philosophies and the way that he presents his ideas, I find so interesting and engaging. Now, although these stories do stand alone, they also do fit together loosely. We're seeing a timeline starting with the civilization on Mars without humans, and then how we interact with that civilization and what happens when humans start actually living on this planet. It's got parts that are really laugh out loud funny. It has parts that are really sad and dark. And it's the emotional gamut. It's all over the place. There's hope in here. There's tragedy in here. And to me, that's the best. I love that in a book that brings you all sorts of different emotions in a way that feels very natural and flowing. My edition of this book has an introduction by Ray Bradbury that he wrote years later after it was published. And he talks about when he met Aldous Huxley, who is another great science fiction and dystopian writer. And Huxley said, "You know what you do? You write poetry." And Bradbury was like, "Wait, what?" and I love hearing that because I've thought that for a while, and I've said that in these videos that what he writes is prose, but it is very poetic. It does flow very nicely, and there's a cadence to it that often is almost lilting or soothing, even when he's telling you things that are really sad or really dark or really distressing. It's always a good idea to check content warnings for books, particularly ones that were published in the last century. I do want to share a little bit about one of the stories that I liked immensely. It's called Usher 2, and which is a reference to The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, and it was published in 1950 initially. So a number of these stories were published in magazines before they were all collected into one volume. The main character of this story is a man called William Stendhal, and he has moved to Mars and built himself a gothic Poe-inspired mansion. And then he starts to talk about books being burned in 2006. This is, of course, set in the future, in the Great Fire. Interestingly, even though this was published before Fahrenheit 451, it's very clearly a reference to the events in that book. And Fahrenheit 451 was written in iterations, starting with a short story and getting longer and longer until it became the novel that we know today. Poe and Lovecraft and Hawthorne and Ambrose Bierce and all the tales of terror and fantasy and horror, and for that matter, tales of the future, were burned heartlessly. They passed a law. Oh, it started very small. In 1999, it was a grain of sand. They began by controlling books of cartoons, and then detective books, and of course films, one way or another, one group or another. Political bias, religious prejudice, union pressures. There was always a minority afraid of something, and a great majority afraid of the dark, afraid of the future, afraid of the past, afraid of the present, afraid of themselves and shadows of themselves, afraid of the word politics, which again became a synonym for communism along the more reactionary elements, so I hear, and it was worth your life to use the word. And with a screw tightened here, a bolt fastened there, a push, a pull, a yank, art and literature were soon like a great twine of taffy strung about, being twisted in braids and tied in knots and thrown in all directions, until there was no more resiliency and no more savor to it. Then the film cameras chopped short, and the theaters turned dark, and the print presses trickled down from a great Niagara of reading matter to a mere innocuous dripping of pure material. Oh, the word escape was radical too, I tell you. Every man, they said, must face reality, must face the here and now. Everything that was not so must go. All the beautiful literary lies and flights of fancy must be shot in midair. So they lined them up against a library wall one Sunday morning 30 years ago in 2006. They lined them up, St. Nicholas and the Headless Horseman and Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin and Mother Goose. Oh, what a wailing! And shot them down, and burned the paper castles and the fairy frogs and the old kings and the people who lived happily ever after, for of course it was a fact that nobody lived happily ever after, and once upon a time became no more. And they spread the ashes of the phantom rickshaw with the rubble of the land of Oz. They filleted the bones of Glinda the Good and Ozma, and shattered polychrome in a spectroscope, and served Jack Pumpkinhead with meringue at the biologist's ball. The beanstalk died in a bramble of red tape. Sleeping Beauty awoke at the kiss of a scientist and expired at the fatal puncture of his syringe. And they made Alice drink something from a bottle which reduced her to a size where she could no longer cry curiouser and curiouser. And they gave the looking glass one hammer blow to smash it and every red king and oyster away. I read that passage about a week ago, and it stuck in my head, and I marked it. And because I thought, this is a video. I thought I've got to read this. And it felt so immediate to me, because it is immediate, because there are so many people tearing down fantasy or trying to say it doesn't matter, we shouldn't read it. And you may know, particularly if you've watched my other videos on Ray Bradbury, that he was very anti-censorship and his books were censored. And one of the things that I love so much about science fiction, good science fiction, dystopia, good dystopia, is that the writing is so prescient. It's spooky in many ways when you read something like this and think, gosh, well, that was 75 years ago. Surely things have changed. Things have changed, but not as much as we would like, and not as much as we were hoping. Not as much as Bradbury certainly would have been hoping. I can assume he was hoping that it would change significantly by now. And yet it hasn't, or it did for a bit, and we've backslid. And so all of this is to say, one, this is a great book, and it's not all about censorship. It's just that one story, but it's such a great book about colonialism, about the impact of humanity on a planet, about society, about people, about humans as individuals, and also Martians as individuals. And it's so beautifully done. So please consider reading this book, because it's amazing. But also, whatever you do, whatever kinds of books you like, always keep reading.